Bonjour à tous. Alors, c'est le canal 2 pour le français, sur votre, parce que je vais parler un peu en français. Donc, après avoir étudié les propriétaires terriens et les producteurs, nous commençons avec les marchands et acteurs financiers, la première partie, puisqu'il y en aura plusieurs. Elle va nous occuper 3 séances. Cette séance va nous proposer un aller-retour pour Séville, en passant par les colonies atlantiques françaises et espagnoles et la Haute-Allemagne. Je vais tout de suite passer la parole à Mark Steele de la Aldo Historical Society, qui va aborder la conjoncture particulière de 1570 à Séville à travers les déboires des banques Espinosa et Morga.
Merci Philippe. Can everybody hear me? I'm told, was a little confused because Carlos will be sitting there, but I'm quite happy to swap places with you and sit down there. I'm sitting in the Siege Perilous because I've seen a couple of people nearly fall off, so if I get near the edge, perhaps you'll shout out and let me know. I'd like to thank Philip, of course, and also Katia for suggesting a subject which I've been interested in for more years than I care to remember. So it was very exciting to hear that we were going to be discussing this topic, which I think is very important. I don't know, some of us might be wishing for a world without bankruptcy by the end of the week. It's an interesting concept. This refers to a paper by Douglas Baird, who is quite an eminent legal scholar. And he had a thought experiment of a world without bankruptcy. Presumably, this would enable other types of debt collection procedures to operate in a free market environment. And he was very heavily criticised by Elizabeth Warren, who's also a law professor, but who's also a Democratic senator for Maryland, and has been heavily involved in drafting bankruptcy legislation. She said it was very convenient to imagine a world without bankruptcy because it's completely self-referential. I didn't think Baird needed to just imagine it. I mean, go back into the past and you can find a world without bankruptcy where there was no formal bankruptcy procedure. Now, as I understand it, the People's Republic of China, China actually had a bankruptcy law from 1906 to 1907, which wasn't very effective. It wasn't until 1986 that it had something like a comprehensive bankruptcy law, but in fact it's still far from comprehensive. As I understand it, there's no personal bankruptcy legislation outside of the Shenzhen district and Hong Kong. There's the question of insolvency and bankruptcy, which has been raised a few times today. I just quickly say insolvency might be distinguished from bankruptcy, which is a more specific legal category. I think we had insolvency before we had bankruptcy, and before we had insolvency, there was always debt collection because people refused to pay and various informal and formal procedures were developed. Progressive bankruptcy law, I'd like to just refer to the great English legal historian Sir William Holdsworth, whose History of English Law is in 17 volumes, not the most exciting book, but he talked about a rational law of bankruptcy as being an essential feature of a successful commercial environment, and he had a sort of Whig view of bankruptcy law developing, gradually getting better. I reacted against this in a paper I gave in 1990 because I'm never convinced that bankruptcy law is completely rational. Bankruptcy law tends to grow like a coral. As I say here, the legislator, I was told by a practitioner once informally, is always shooting at a moving target. And I am hesitant to rely on the authority of the late Justice Antonin Scalia, a strict constructionist or traditionalist. He said a bankruptcy law has little to do with natural justice, and perhaps correct. If you really want to see How the Law Grows Like a Coral. This is actually my copy of the 17th edition of the annotated guide to the English bankruptcy and insolvency legislation. It's only 2,700 pages, and I wouldn't say it's a book I read with any great pleasure. It is nonetheless very interesting, because if we ever feel tempted to say the bankruptcy procedure in 16th century Seville or 18th century England or wherever was convoluted, just try reading that and you'll see how difficult it can be. The 2025 edition you can now pre-order of this book. It's not cheap, it's £676 sterling, but you can pick up old copies. Doug Baird didn't imagine a world without lawyers. He was actually, didn't get mentioned. He wanted a world without bankruptcy. Sounds great. He never mentioned doing away with lawyers, but Shakespeare, not Shakespeare, one of his characters, we have to be careful. I don't think Shakespeare actually believed in killing all the lawyers, but one of his characters in Jack Cade's Revolt certainly did. Now, I'd want to say just a few words, because I promised my friend Marcus that I would keep within the time limit. I did tell him I was going to spend an hour and then he wouldn't get to speak, but no, I'll only spend 20 minutes if I can. If you're an economic historian, obviously you like to see a long-term statistical series, and it's very, very tempting to use them as an indicator of financial crises or whatever, and in fact they are. I'm going to just almost randomly look at a couple of series that I've come across in the past. They're quite old examples. Now, the bankruptcy series for Amsterdam and Lyon, which are illustrated in a minute, they can be difficult to relate to specific financial stress or economic crises. It's an interesting point. It very often crops up in the literature that the bankruptcy rate can rise during a boom because inefficient enterprises are forced out of business. Lorenzo Sanz's statistics for Seville, I think perhaps a little bit different, a bit more striking. This is pulled from, I'm sorry it's not terribly clear, but figures for bankruptcies in Amsterdam and other Dutch cities. I know we've got some Dutch historians here who'll be able to say a lot more about this. But this is in Parker and Wilson's Guide to the Sources of Economic History. And Jan van Herten, who I'm sure quite a few of us will remember, Professor van Hert, he points out that you can't always tie the peaks in the statistics to financial crises. One could say more. Roger Gascon's wonderful book on Lyon in the 16th century, he says conjoncture, using bankruptcy statistics as an indication. The problem is you've got a very small number of observations there, so you do become a little bit doubtful as to what they indicate. Most of my academic career in history has been about the financial crisis of 1575 to 1577, so I was pleased to see there does seem to be something going on there, but once again, I advise caution. It's difficult, though, to sort of underestimate something like Lorenzo Sanz's statistics. I've managed to underestimate it by squashing them a little bit in order to get them on the graph properly, but the top figure's 56. And that's in 1566 to 1567, when the government confiscated bullion from the Indies fleet. And then per area that I'm interested in, 1573 to 77, you've got another peak as well. In Lorenzo Sanz's book, the peak in 1566 to 7 is much more impressive, but we had difficulty getting it on the graph. Obviously Seville attracts one's attention for all sorts of reasons. Now, I simply say it's difficult to say much about 16th century Seville, the money market, without either being trite or going into an enormous amount of detail. But most authorities will tell you that it was unstable. Once again, I come back to Lorenzo Sanz, which he says debility, frequent failures, quiebras endémicas, and he said that if you were a trader in the Indies trade, they were people with very cold-blooded merchants, risk-taker, tended to live on credit, but in a financial market which was as diverse and ramified as Seville, you would live on credit. Without credit and speculation, it would have been very difficult to operate. There were attempts to regulate the system of licensed deposit banks. The prior and consuls of Seville were heavily involved with the government in having an underwriting system protecting the licensing the deposit banks and protecting them by an underwriting system of guarantors, fiadores. Now, you would think that if you had a lot of guarantors of banks, it would prevent problems happening, but it seems to be that it might not have done, might have actually contributed to the problems. I come on to, obviously, 1575 as the year of the Decreto, Philip II, suspending payments. The contribution to the difficult business environment in Seville, as well as the confiscations of bullion, was the suspensions of payments on the Castilian floating debt, 1557, 1560, 1575, 1596. They went on into the 17th century, of course. Once again, you could say a lot about Philip II's financial difficulties. I'm delighted to hear that Carlos Alvarez Nogal, I believe, has a book on Philip II's finances in the press, and I'm sure we'll all be wanting to look at that. I know we'll want to. Given that the question of bankruptcy versus insolvency terminology has come up, I'd just like to say state bankruptcies seems to be, I think, first appeared in the 19th century in some German historians like Konrad Habler, Staatsbankrotten. I'm wondering whether it's the right word. I've always been a little bit unhappy talking about state bankruptcies. Drelichman wrote a paper and, of course, the book about the sustainable debts of the Spanish monarchy, or Castilian monarchy, if you like. So one might call them sustainable debt scheduling operations. That's a point for discussion. Quote a Scottish political economist who's not Adam Smith for once, Sir James Stewart, Inquiry into the Principles of Political Economy, 1767. He's the economist who Adam Smith pointedly ignored when he wrote The Wealth of Nations. There's no reference to Stewart's book. He was very offended. The idea of a nation's becoming bankrupt to itself, I have always looked upon as a contradiction, but that it may become bankrupt to the rest of the world is quite consistent with reason and common sense. Well, we come back to Seville. Obviously, those bankruptcy statistics from Lorenzo Sanz make you pause for thought. As I've said before, the function of deposit banker in Seville was highly regulated and concentrated in a few enterprises. And in 1576, after the decree was issued, September 1575, and I presume most of us know these decrees suspended payments on a large part of the Castilian floating debt, aiming at restructuring the debt and satisfying some creditors by issuing annuities, bonds, etc., etc. And a settlement was agreed with Philip II's creditors in 1577, which wasn't terribly favourable to the Crown, but on the other hand, it was a settlement of sorts. And there are various ways. The literature on the debt crises is absolutely enormous now, and is growing, also growing like a coral. Espinosa and Morga, the two licensed deposit banks, were both exposed in their own way. The Espinosa brothers, the bank had been running under various names since 1553, I think. Their brother was Juan Fernández de Espinosa, who was the royal treasurer. Morga was heavily involved in government contracts provisioning and that got him into quite a bit of trouble. I was delighted to learn that Carlos, when I was preparing this paper, Carlos has published a very detailed quantitative paper. The documentation on the Morga failure particularly is quite extensive, and I refer you for the quantitative side of this very much to the paper which Carlos published in the Cuadernos de Historia Moderna in, I was going to say 1517, but he's not that young, 2017. I, as well as the sources that are available at Simancas, particularly Consejo y Juntas de Hacienda 164, Legajo 164, which has quite detailed reports, if anybody wants to go and look at that. The very energetic correspondence of Simón Ruiz at Medina del Campo, which were Luis Pérez, and mainly Luis Pérez and Francisco Morovelli. It wasn't a perfect market information, but in the circumstances of the time, Simón Ruiz could be very well informed about what was going on. And Pérez and Morovelli, and there were other correspondents as well, they were saying that the civilian market was already in difficulties, stretezza, as early as March 1575, well before the Decreto, because of course you had this rhythm of the return of the Indies fleet, and everybody was waiting for it to come. It would normally be in that sort of situation, but then obviously in September you had the announcement or the news of the Decreto. When the Espinosa and Morga banks eventually failed in March and April 1576, and I could give a very detailed, it will be in the written paper, it's partly there, a very detailed recension of the letters describing what was going on. The Espinosas were believed to be heavily compromised, possibly failing for about 2 million ducats, and they had financial connections with their close relative, Juan Fernández de Espinosa. Pedro de Morga's problems appear to have been compounded by his involvement in government provisioning contracts. And Libranzas, he'd provided a lot of provisions for under Galleries and Frontiers, Galeras y Fronteras, and he had Libranzas based on the rights to collect money from the sales tax of Seville, which he wasn't able to perform on. Local merchants in Seville, as reported by Pérez and Morovelli, accused the Espinosa or Espinosas with debts of around 2 million ducats of trying to satisfy some creditors at the expense of others. Pedro de Morga's debts were probably about 25% of Espinosa's, but because he was so heavily involved with the government and seemed to owe the government money, this resulted in the dispatch of a juez de comisión from Madrid in the person of Álvaro García de Toledo, which led to the sequestration of Pedro de Morga's personal assets, which are inventoried in Álvaro García's reports. And there's quite an extensive list. There are various different reports there listing the contents of his house, cutlery, jewels, pearls, etc., etc. Quite interesting. Years ago, when I first started looking at these documents, it was 1982, so it's a while ago now, I was thinking it would be nice to produce an edition of them all. I'm not going to do that now, but it might appeal to someone in this room. It would be very useful to have a full edition of these documents. It gives an interesting perspective on the sort of position of a merchant banker at this time. We're only a bit short of time here, but still, I've got half a minute left, I hope. Well, despite the safe arrival of the Indies fleet in 1576, and there were no confiscations of bullion in 75 or 76, I think because the government did have a strategy. They didn't want to actually mess things up. They were trying to set up systems of asiento payments, which were mainly agreements for delivering money abroad to finance the activities of the Spanish Empire in Italy and in the Low Countries, of course. Business at the Seville market remains sluggish, and it's reported in Chonu, Séville's Atlantique, which I'm sure we all know, that the prior and consuls of Seville requested that the armada going out in 1576 should be reduced in size simply because there wasn't enough financing. As I understand it, new deposit institutions, because Morgan and Espinosa were not able to re-establish, were not licensed until 1581 and 1583. It seems that the widespread dispersion of sureties, which might have underwritten the stability of Pedro de Morga's bank, possibly had the opposite effect. There's a plea from, I think it's Andrés de Laria, who found himself in prison somewhere in Spain, who couldn't perform on his sureties because he was unable to proceed against Genoese assentistas, who said they couldn't pay him because the king wasn't paying them. This indicates the sort of tentacular nature of the financial crisis. Sevilla. This little print. There are only 3 copies of this print known. One's in the British Museum, another one in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, and there's one in Stockholm. But a print dealer called Frame in Madrid found a 4th copy. It was engraved by Janssen in The Hague in 1617, and the state that Frame found is the best possible engraving, and the picture doesn't quite show the extent of it. It was difficult to get it all in one place, but I have a reproduction which I perhaps during the break I'll lay out on one of the seats, and if anybody wants to look at it, they can. It's a superbly detailed picture and topographically extremely interesting. And thank you for your time.
Merci beaucoup pour cette communication et cet effet à la fin avec cette merveille qui nous a mis sous les yeux. Je passe de suite la parole à Markus Denzel, qui est collègue et ami à l'université de Leipzig, et qui va envisager la question des risques en termes de résilience, ou plutôt de capacité d'une entreprise à préserver et utiliser son potentiel de résilience, et ceci à partir des marchands banquiers de Haute-Allemagne pour un long XVIe siècle. Mais une courte intervention.
I hope so. Merci, Monsieur le Président. Dear colleagues and friends, risks of all kinds could and can have such different effects on merchant bankers and their companies that some benefited from them, while others became insolvent or even bankrupt. Why this was and is so can be answered in an innovative way from the perspective of the research paradigm of resilience, which describes the ability to master risks and cope crises. All entrepreneurial activities to strengthen, preserve, and utilize the resilience potential of a particular business can be described as resilience management, which generates resilience of an enterprise as a result. Focused on different case studies from Upper Germany, my aim is to work out with strategies and instruments merchant bankers of the 16th century used to succeed in their risk and resilience management, or why they failed. My main questions are shown on the slide. Thereby, it should be noted that both risk and resilience management are concepts of contemporary business administration that may be seen anachronistic in the context of a study of pre-modernity. However, Previous application to questions of business history has shown that they can certainly contribute to a better and deeper understanding of entrepreneurial decisions or systemic developments of enterprise, as will be the case in the following. In sharp contrast to traditional short-term corporate risk management, resilience management allows a company to develop a rapid and flexible, yet long-term and sustainable defensive and offensive strategy against new, unexpected dangers and risks that arise as byproducts of interdependent business operations. Resilience management also includes crisis and disaster as well as systemic vulnerabilities of enterprises and individual vulnerabilities of entrepreneurs and their families. It has all possible uncertainties in its holistic view. Resilience management results from a planned series of safeguards against discontinuities. An analytical grid can be derived from previous theoretical considerations which refer to the complex interactions of 4 research guiding parameters. First, the active entrepreneurial affinity for resilience in the form of the entrepreneur's or the company's creative willingness to resilience, which, based on the diagnosis of changing framework conditions and the resulting external and internal risk factors, implies the will to change, but also the ability to implement change. It is the power of the entrepreneur. Second, the application of specific resilience strategies, which currently and historically have included the use of capital, the intensification of networking with shareholders and interest groups that pursued joint management goals, and the strengthening of internal knowledge management. The most important manifestations of these resilience strategies in practical business activities are diversification and networking, the professionalization of those responsible, the institutionalization and legalization of business activities, capitalization, or, in the case of failure, liquidation, and, if necessary, the transformation of the company. These strategies are just as constitutive for resilience management as, third, capital, networks, knowledge, information, and values, as well as skills and attitudes at the management and employee level as the underlying material and immaterial resource of resilience, whose availability and differentiated combination, options and development techniques can develop different mechanisms of action. And fourth, the implementation of resilience instruments or tools, such as accounting or association contracts, as well as resilience media for external communication and internal knowledge management by means of price currents or merchants' manuals, for example. Thereby, it should be emphasized that the parameters of resilience management cannot be precisely separated from each other, but often occur side by side or in close interdependence, as it will be seen in the following. It can be assumed that all trading companies examined were making conscious efforts to adapt to changing conditions, to withstand and overcome crises, and, if necessary, to transform internal company structures and thus achieve organizational resilience, even if this cannot be explicitly proven in the sources in each case. However, the entrepreneur's willingness to engage in such resiliency, the so-called resilience affinity or entrepreneurial resilience, varied greatly among the responsible managers of the individual companies. So, the possibilities of adapting to the changing framework conditions probably play the most important role. The liquidity or capital issues, it is a company's capability to overcome a crisis situation by injecting capital and thus maintaining liquidity and creditworthiness, is of paramount importance. In the case of the Augsburg trading companies, most capital investments generally came from within the family network. It is evident that the undercapitalization of a company like that of the Höchstädters made it particularly vulnerable and therefore more susceptible to crisis, up to and including bankruptcy. Other, more generally recognizable resilience strategies for adapting to changing conditions were the diversification or concentration of business activities. In addition, most trading companies provided banking services, while some also acted as marine insurers and were involved in mining or manufacturing. Crown financing, it is the granting of loans to rulers, princes, high-ranking clerics, landlords, and nobles, which generally paid high interest rates, but were also associated with significant risks due to their unreliable repayments, was particularly important for the risk-taking Augsburgers. While the combination of different lines of business could contribute significantly to the resilience of a company, as a crisis in one line of business could be offset or at least mitigated by good results in another, involvement in crown financing generally increased the vulnerability of a trading company. The extent of this vulnerability depended on the volume of the loans granted and, above all, on the collateral provided. Strategies employed by some trading houses to invest the accumulated assets on a long-term basis with good returns but low risk, thus preserving them for future generations, played a special role but were also company-specific. These included investments in real estate and manorial rights. At least in the case of the Fuggers, this long-term strategy was extremely successful. The fact that Raimund Fugger, the brother of the Regierer Anton, took care of the landed estates as a full-time job shows the overall strategic importance of this branch within the company. These and other minor resilience strategies were supported by a wide range of resilience tools or instruments. These include, in particular, the use of bills of exchange and marine insurance, as these promoted the endeavors of the managements to reduce risk in an inherently risky business field wherever this appeared possible with the resources of the time. Legal instruments, by contrast, were generally designed for the long term, be it the organizational structure of the trading company, fixed in a partnership agreement, or the transfer of the company to the next generation of entrepreneurs in a will or family statute. Among the major instruments of resilience management, accounting played a key role that can hardly be overestimated. More than any other economic, social, or legal safeguards, it constitutes a decisive anchor of business activity and the central hinge between upstream information and knowledge management on the one hand and the strategic planning of future business activities on the other. In particular, the extensive accounting records of the Fugger family allow such conclusions. Further media of information management are business letters with attached price currents and handwritten newspapers and, if available, court records or protocols of shareholders' meetings. Social capital, which is attributed to an entrepreneur or a company by the outside world, is particularly difficult to grasp and must therefore be assessed indirectly. This makes it weighting as a factor in resilience management or for the resilience of a company much more difficult than for the other instruments, because the social capital did not save a company from final bankruptcy. As a whole, the functional significance of social networks and ultimately social capital for resiliency in terms of creditworthiness alone can be regarded as rather limited. Last but not least, a secular phenomenon has to be mentioned, which can be interpreted as a resilience strategy sui generis concerning the structural development of trading companies. A process of concentration set in the course of which the circle of shareholders was reduced and increasingly limited to the nuclear family. In the long term, the trend was towards sole proprietorships. From the perspective of economic vulnerability and resilience research, the structural change of companies can be interpreted as a consequence of entrepreneurial efforts to achieve resilience in the course of the commoditization process of the 16th century. In addition to reducing costs, possible reasons for structural changes within the companies were the avoidance of internal conflicts and the concentration on a few selected business areas that were deemed particularly profitable. Smaller organizational entities are simply easier to make or keep resilient. They offered the most reliable form of risk management, as Thomas Sefley pointed out. Of course, this does not mean that sole traders were immune against failure. Nonetheless, the likelihood of overcoming a disruption or crisis appears to have been greater if business was conducted within the framework of a lean, efficient organization, usually within the nuclear family, than if it was done within the framework of a traditional trading company with a large workforce. This makes the structural development of trading companies in the 16th century understandable and explainable from the perspective of the resilience paradigm. Various scenarios of failure show why merchant banking companies went bankrupt despite the presumed resilience management, as exemplified by the Höchstädter and Mannlich companies from Augsburg and the Hirschvogel from Nuremberg. In these cases, a certain degree of resilience management must have been achieved before the decisive corporate crisis. They all operated successfully for years or even decades and enjoyed a high level of prestige and creditworthiness in the business world. Yet, at some point, all three reached the tipping point, which caused negative reversal of their fortunes and ultimately ended in bankruptcy. What were the main causes of the business failure of formerly highly respected, successful companies? The causes of the fallout in Upper Germany are regularly cited as the economic slowdown in the second half of the 16th century and the high-risk transactions with crowns and government, not least due to the long-term capital commitment as well as the years following the first two Spanish suspension of payment in 1560 and 1575. The fundamental problem of almost all trading houses in the 16th century, the interplay of a too thin equity base and a too long-term capital commitment, was also one of the decisive factors for the decline of the respective companies. On the one hand, high annual interest payments were required, which placed an additional burden on the budget. On the other hand, such deposits were generally only short-term and could therefore be terminated comparatively quickly. Even if this quickly normally meant a 6-month or annual period, a wave of terminations could have a devastating effect if the capital was lent to a ruler for the longer period, tied up in a mine that was becoming unprofitable, or in an overseas trading voyage lasting several years. It was precisely the withdrawal of capital by depositors that could be the final decisive factor in the insolvency of a company. The risk of such a run was probably all the greater the less the company in question was networked with other local merchant families. Rumors and bad news about payment difficulties or even the collapse of a close business partner or a relative bearing the same name could be responsible for the onset of payment difficulties. If speculative exchange transactions or losses from privateers were added to this, the capital base could be so quickly eroded that bankruptcy became inevitable. Furthermore, other causes should be also highlighted. Firstly, there was the underestimation or misjudgment of the risk of individual lines of business, which was generally based on a lack of information, which can mean both a lack of relevant knowledge about the specifics of a particular branch of trade. It seems that it was not primarily book knowledge about production methods that was decisive here, but rather up-to-date market information about prices, supply, demand, and transportation options. The lack of information also meant that the essential basis for appropriate stabilization or adaptation management to changing circumstances and, in the worst case, for crisis management was missing. The lack of information had a particularly negative effect when it came to bookkeeping and accounting, and could lead to a complete misjudgment of the financial situation of a trading company. A final important factor in a company collapse was the internal constitution of the trading company, its internal organization. The branches not only caused high costs, but could also cause risks by filling management positions with unsuitable trading servants. A lack of communication, information flows, embezzlement or transactions by the factors on their own account, a lack of loyalty of the trading servants to the corporate policy of the head office were just some of the sources of risks that could drastically increase the vulnerability of the company in a short space of time. These parameters, which played a significant role in the various decline and collapse scenarios over and above the individual company factors, can be summarized as a result of a lack of or inadequate resilience. The information deficits meant that in many cases a crucial foundation on which successful resilience management could have been built was missing. And even if this was the case, the way in which resilience management was structured by those responsible in a company still played a key role in the direction of more stabilized or more adaptive resilience. Furthermore, none of the three trading companies examined provided sufficient evidence of comprehensive resilience management for the purpose of long-term stabilization and consolidation in the months or years of decline. As a result, the crisis was not permanently pushed back or even overcome, but from this perspective, it is not possible to determine with certainty whether and to what extent this lack of resilience, inadequate resilience, or misdirected resilience promoted the respective corporate crisis. To sum up, the application of resilience strategies and tools could not always prevent a company from becoming insolvent or going bankrupt. At some point, the tipping point could come when the previous resilience management was no longer sufficient to overcome the crisis, resulting in insolvency or even bankruptcy. This was particularly the case if a company relied on anchored rather than adaptive resilience in its organizational resilience. This is because of if a company is only anchored resilient, its primary goal is to bounce back from a disruption to the initial situation, but not to adapt to changing conditions or decision variables. Such anchored resilience may not be sufficient to cope with a massive disruptive situation. This would explain the examples of insolvencies and bankruptcies despite prior efforts at resilience management. But if a company was able to overcome the numerous challenges and the disruptions of everyday business life, then such a company has also been successful in business, often for generations. Resilient business is always based on sustainability and forward-looking management, not necessarily focused on quick profits, but striving at secure earnings over long periods of time. The sheer size of a company, the number of employees, the level of turnover or other indicators are not decisive From the perspective of resilience, smaller units are often, if not usually, more crisis-resistant and durable than too large ones. For the 16th century, it can be stated that many large upper German trading companies were transformed into smaller units that were managed by members of a nuclear family. New companies were regularly founded in the form of individual companies or sole proprietorships. The medieval super companies were simply no longer resilient enough to cope with the challenges of the fundamental commercialization process of the early modern period and in its inherent disruptions. This is a remarkable finding that can plausibly explain the structural changes in the early modern business world. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup, Marcus, pour cette communication et cette approche méthodologique rigoureuse et précise. On a vu qu'on a recroisé les fugueurs, ce qui, je pense, suscitera pas mal de questions. Et je vais passer maintenant la parole à Teresa Debourg et Ramona Negron de l'Université de Leiden, fraîchement diplômée, non, je crois. Le temps que ça traduise. Qui s'intéresse au dégagement d'un modèle de gestion des risques et des conflits à travers l'analyse des stratégies de gestion mises en place par les entrepreneurs hollandais dans l'exploitation des ressources coloniales espagnoles du XVIIe siècle et françaises du XVIIIe siècle.
Merci pour cette introduction, Monsieur le Président, and good afternoon. Today we will present a first comparative assessment of risk mitigating strategies in early modern trans-imperial exploitation, which is indeed a conjunction of our respective dissertations on Dutch entrepreneurship and investment in the Spanish and French empires. Doesn't work. Oh, it does. Maritime and long-distance colonial trade are often associated with higher uncertainty and elevated risks compared to land-based activities. The scale and length of ocean-borne trade increased exposure to adverse weather, complicated the synchronization of information, and required extensive reliance on credit. Recent studies emphasize the role of political economic frameworks in both creating and mitigating risk for business entities. A number of colonizing powers oriented these frameworks to retain the profits of colonial commerce for the benefit of the state and the sovereign's subjects. Trans-imperial exploitation, where non-subjects or foreigners sought to access another empire's resources, therefore often occurred in a restrictive, if not outright hostile, institutional environment. This paper explores this colonial exploitation in a trans-imperial context, where risk and uncertainty were heightened or particular. Compared to the more typical intra-empire settings, it featured what we call institutional risk, or the risks posed by institutions seeking to enforce restrictive political economies. We show Dutch business entities developed resilient strategies to navigate risks, working both within and beyond the political, economic, and legal frameworks that govern their activities. By comparing Dutch strategies in the Spanish Empire in the 17th century and the French Empire in the 18th century, we gain insights that challenge assumptions in the literature on risk and uncertainty. First, we apply our findings to debates surrounding the chronology of long-distance colonial trade. It is often claimed that, while fraught with uncertainty in the early stages of its development, it became more predictable by the 18th century by means of individual and institutional adaptation to accumulated experience and information. We investigate whether Dutch strategies support the notion that business behavior evolved from responding to uncertainty to managing risk. Second, we compare Dutch strategies in Spain and France, both committed to excluding non-subjects, although the details of how they practically enforced this exclusion could differ. We analyze how Dutch merchants adapted their strategies to the specific political economic context of these empires and whether information and experience was transferable between empires.
Although European expansion has long been a key focus in scholarly discussions of overseas colonization, The resulting empires have traditionally been viewed as separate national projects rather than as integrated European ventures. In recent decades, however, scholarship has shifted to emphasize the transnational and transimperial nature of empire building. Pre-modern states often lack the means to consolidate power without relying on private resources, resulting in public-private partnerships. The expansion of these states overseas only exaggerated the problem of resource constraints, as domestic resources were insufficient to sustain these ventures. Consequently, resources essential for the exploitation of empire, commercial, financial, or natural, were sourced across national borders. Similarly, profits generated from colonial products, such as cash crops, spilled beyond the empire that produced them, creating a complex, interconnected economic system crossing imperial boundaries. This transnational flow of resources created unease for competing colonial powers, who struggled with the paradox of building one's own power whilst dependent on the resources of another. The most comprehensive analyses of these transimperial engagements are found in studies of Dutch involvement in the empires of other European states. In these transimperial ventures, Dutch business entities face the fluctuating landscape of risk and uncertainty that shape their strategies. Knight distinguished between risk, potential loss that can be quantified and mitigated, and uncertainty, events or circumstances that elude precise calculation. Risks included challenges like adverse weather or piracy, which were familiar and manageable through instruments like marine insurance. Uncertainties referred to sudden, unpredictable events, such as changes in political or military conditions, embargoes, shifts in imperial policy, and the cumulative impact this had on the markets. Institutional risk was central to this. Much of the risk Dutch merchants faced when engaging with Spanish and French colonial enterprises stemmed from policies governing foreign participation. Spanish and French authorities severely restricted foreign involvement, so Dutch traders understood the basic risks they faced when attempting to exploit these resources. While institutional risk was present, it could be anticipated, as the legal framework encapsulating these empires was known. However, these regulations were not static. States adapted them in response to new information or shifts in political relations, creating new uncertainties. When changes occurred quickly or without clear signaling, merchants found it increasingly difficult to assess and adapt to the evolving risk landscape. The Spanish case in the 17th century illustrates how institutional risk could be compounded by uncertainty. The Crown of Castile tightly controlled colonial trade, granting exclusive trading rights to Spanish subjects through monopolistic institutions like the Casa de la Contratación in Seville or the Consulados in Seville, Mexico City, and Lima. Foreigners wishing to participate in the Carrera de Indias had to undergo a lengthy naturalization process, which only very few Dutch merchants pursued. Dutch merchants faced high institutional uncertainty, particularly during the 80 Years' War, when Dutch merchants were vulnerable to embargoes, punitive seizures, and the chaos of maritime warfare. These actions were sudden, making them difficult to ensure or predict, and were beyond the scope of financial risk management tools. Following the Peace of Münster in 1648, some uncertainties subsided. This allowed Dutch merchants to stabilize operations, turning unpredictable shocks into foreseeable risks, enabling long-term planning and risk mitigation. However, institutional risk remained high. In contrast, the French case in the 18th century saw more clearly articulated institutional risks. Relations between France and the Dutch Republic were largely stable in the 18th century, and the political and economic framework governing French colonial trade was consistent and clear. France's exclusive coloniale stipulated that only French subjects could engage in commerce with the colonies, effectively barring non-French actors from colonial trade. Violations of these regulations led to confiscations, fines, and imprisonment, but institutional risk remained consistent. Remaining uncertainties arose mainly from the behavior of French colonial administrators, who occasionally allowed non-subjects to engage in trade in response to precarious supply stocks, or from external geopolitical dynamics such as global warfare. During wartime, the exclusive was often suspended, also creating commercial opportunities for non-subjects, neutral traders, who were nevertheless affected by the uncertainties and risk of wartime trade. Despite the volatile risk and uncertainty Dutch business entities faced in both the Spanish and French colonial spheres, they adapted and thrived. They had a range of strategies and instruments at their disposal to facilitate the management of risk, ranging from a careful handling of the principal agent problem to extensive diplomatic lobbying. However, today we examine two strategies in particular: the strategic adoption of subjecthood and instruments to finance risk, such as insurance. These represent, on the one hand, a classic instrument well contextualized in the historiography of maritime risk, uncertainty in institutions, insurance and the financing of risk, and a less commonly discussed but nevertheless important factor, namely subjecthood, to navigate the shifting world of trans-imperial trade.
Subjecthood was central to regimes of exclusion that Dutch business entities had to navigate in trans-imperial trade. Defining subjecthood is challenging, as it often differs across time, place, and legal, social, and cultural contexts. However, two main characteristics are common across definitions, contexts, and historiographies. First, subjecthood was tied to property rights under a sovereign's law, granting the right to use, profit from, and transfer resources. Second, subjecthood was flexible, allowing individuals to manipulate or perform their identity for opportunistic purposes, often to integrate themselves in regimes of property rights. While these dynamics are well documented, subjecthood's role in risk management is less explored. In the protectionist and mercantilist economies of empire, this dynamic was particularly relevant. In both the Spanish and French empires, property rights served to protect subjects' resources while denying many of such rights to non-subjects. Therefore, the resources of non-subjects needed protection from confiscation or appropriation. However, the flexibility of early modern subjecthood created gray areas. The determination of who was a subject and who was not, and by extension the classification of resources, was often ambiguous. This ambiguity allowed Dutch business entities to strategize the subjecthood of themselves, their crews, and their cargoes to rebrand their ventures and evade restrictive regulations. Dutch merchants, for example, frequently manipulated or assembled the subjecthood of their crews to navigate imperial regulatory frameworks, as the subjecthood of crews was often contributing to the legal classification of a vessel. A notable example is the case of Christelijke Ridder from 1605. In response to Spanish embargoes in the 1590s, the ship was rerouted to Arkhangelsk in Russia, where the crew was replaced with English or French seamen. This substitution allowed the ship to rebrand itself through favorable subjecthoods, circumventing Spanish regulations. Similarly, Dutch ships trading with the French West Indies in the 18th century are known to have recruited French sailors to meet the legal criteria of being considered a French ship, despite their Dutch origins. Beyond crew composition, Dutch merchants used additional tactics to obscure the national identity of their vessels and cargo. For example, ship owners or freighters with plausible claims to Spanish or French subjecthood based on ancestry or past residence could assert these claims with the relevant institutions or legal fora to avoid scrutiny. The usage of agents or associates with a more palatable subjecthood is also widely attested to. For example, in 1716, as can be seen on the slide, Philippe Couturier and other merchants testified that merchandise from Cadiz, destined for the Spanish West Indies, was always registered under the name of a native Spaniard to avoid confiscation. The composite nature of long-distance trans-imperial trade, involving actors, merchandise, and logistic resources often drawn from many different geographic nodes, further complicated the identification of a ship's subjecthood. For example, in 1717, a vessel flying Dutch colors arrived in Martinique. Its papers were Dutch, and it had come from Amsterdam. Its owner was a French subject living in Havana, a Spanish colony, and its cargo was partially owned by Spanish subjects. Due to the mixed nature of the venture, French authorities could not determine the associated subjecthood of the ship and its cargo, leading to its acquittal. This case illustrates how Dutch merchants exploited the grey area of subjecthood to evade legal and economic obstacles. By rebranding their operational identities, they accessed a more favorable regime of property rights and penetrated markets close to outsiders. The flexibility inherent in subjecthood as both a legal and social construct played a pivotal role in anticipating institutional risk. And by exploiting this flexibility, Dutch business entities could reframe their identities to navigate restrictions of imperial economies.
Marine insurance is credited with playing a central role in transforming long-distance colonial trade from an uncertain to a mere risky endeavor over the course of the early modern period. The growth and maturation of integrated insurance markets are said to have both resulted from an accelerated accumulation of information, thus improving the predictability of colonial trades. The 17th and 18th centuries witnessed significant changes in the structure of insurance markets, though their foundational elements remained an adequate capital market, appropriate institutions, and robust state support. They enabled risk-averse merchants to pursue high-risk, high-return ventures they might have otherwise avoided. However, we argue that trans-imperial ventures entailed even higher risks, coupled with uncertainties that were, by most definitions, uninsurable. This complicated the use of traditional marine insurance instruments. The flexible financing strategies employed by Dutch business entities in the 17th century Spanish and in the 18th century French colonial trade offer insights into two key aspects. First, they provide data on the comparative risks of these ventures relative to more conventional intra-European or intra-empire trade. By comparing insurance premiums, we can understand how business entities perceive these ventures. Second, they shed light on the extent to which insurance markets could still service these higher risk transactions. In the 17th century Spanish colonial trade, bottomry loans were a primary instrument used to finance voyages. Bottomry loans provided immediate capital and transferred a large portion of the voyage risks to the lender, resulting in significantly higher interest rates than those applied to safer routes. For example, interest on Baltic voyages typically ranged from 5 to 13%, but loans to Spanish America often carried interest rates of 63%, with a median of 70%, and could climb as high as 80 to 100% for particularly hazardous ventures like the slave trade. For instance, in 1649, as we can see on the slide, two skippers secured nearly 50,000 guilders in bottomry loans for a slave trading expedition to the Canary Islands, West Africa, Margarita, and Caracas, with monthly premiums reaching up to 6%. Despite these exorbitant rates, many merchants deemed the arrangement worthwhile to capitalize on goods that commanded premium prices, especially when they arrived ahead of competing fleets. Slower. I will try. By tailoring repayment periods to the length and risk of each journey, such as calculating interest monthly for longer or seasonally sensitive routes, these arrangements allowed merchants to share risks in ways that regular marine insurance could not. For high-risk ventures, investors found that shouldering initially high interest could still yield substantial returns, exceeding more moderate options like government bonds or life annuities, which rarely surpassed 8% after 1606. Bottomry loans thus became a cornerstone of early modern maritime finance, enabling traders in Amsterdam to diversify their portfolios and capitalize on trans-imperial markets, despite threats of confiscation, monopolistic Spanish trade policies, or seasonal price fluctuations. However, when examining notarial and judicial records regarding Dutch shipping to the French West Indies, bottomry is rarely mentioned, indicating that it was not considered suitable for securing these particular trans-imperial ventures. Instead, general average and regular marine insurance emerged as preferred instruments for 18th century French colonial trade. Although London is commonly cited as the leading insurance market of the 18th century, Amsterdam maintains its prominence due to its substantial capital pool. Amsterdam's underwriters became internationally renowned for their ability to insure virtually any risk, route, asset, or commodity. To illustrate this premise, we examined notarial contracts related to Dutch vessels involved in neutral trade with the French West Indies during the 7 Years' War. Faced with British attacks threatening Atlantic supply lines, France temporarily allowed neutral non-subjects, including the Dutch, to trade. While this lowered the institutional risk as forthcoming from French institutions, instead it was British institutions creating these risks. In the British view, neutral shipping in French service was an act of war, therefore permitting the seizure of these Dutch vessels and cargoes. There is an observable shift in Dutch business entities' perception of neutral French colonial trade over the course of the 7 Years' War, from one of acceptable uncertainty to an unacceptably high risk. Up until 1759, neutral trade activity was high, encouraged by the perceived reduction in institutional risk from France. However, the unexpected intensity of the British response, including the systematic captures of vessels, had become a known risk by 1759. This led to a significant reduction in neutral trade, with the Dutch opting for safer inter-imperial or inter-European routes for the remainder of the war. Dutch merchants turned to regular marine insurance and general average to secure cargoes during this period. The average value of a return cargo from the French West Indies was 150,000 guilders. Notarial records reveal that these ventures were insured across multiple international markets, with business entities contracting coverage from several underwriters. Risks were shared on an international scale, providing resilience against local, regional, or national shocks in the context of the ongoing multipolar war. While Amsterdam's market played a prominent role, other markets in the Dutch Republic, Iberia, and Italy were also tapped. However, the French market, particularly in Paris, was less competitive, despite efforts by the French state to develop this sector. This is evident in the case of the St. Fernando, captured by the British in 1759. The freighters, Junelot and Parel, had insured the sugar cargo at several markets, among others 15,500 guilders at 25% in Amsterdam, 11,600 guilders at 30% in Zeeland, and 36,900 livres tournois at 65% in Paris. When they discovered the cargo was overinsured, they annulled the French policies, confirming that the French premiums were not competitive. Other records show premiums ranging from 20 to 30%, much higher than the 1 to 2.5% premiums for inter-European or inter-Caribbean routes. One witness statement, dated 1758, details the reluctance of an Amsterdam ship owner to lend his vessel to trade with the French Empire. I'll give it to you because I am going to...
Because it was impossible to obtain insurances for it, quote. This is a slight clue that even the most sophisticated insurance markets of its time were not, allegedly, always able or willing to cover the risks of certain ventures. Despite these challenges, the willingness to pay significantly elevated premiums in both the Spanish and the French cases underscore the volatility of trans-imperial commerce and the allure of lucrative returns. By balancing high profits against the risk of a total loss, these risk transfer mechanisms were vital in sustaining trans-imperial trade networks during an era of geopolitical uncertainties and fluctuating economic conditions. While the precise instruments, bottomry and marine insurance, differed depending on the specific context, both helped to facilitate the continuation and expansion of trans-imperial trade during the early modern period. In all, Dutch business entities seeking to exploit Spanish and French colonial resources faced significant risks and uncertainties. Although both empires were encapsulated by exclusionist political economic regimes, their constellation differed in the details across geopolitical and chronological lines. The Spanish Empire in the 17th century was characterized by institutional risk, but even deeper uncertainty, spurred by war, embargoes, and shifting policies. In contrast, the French Empire in the 18th century offered a more stable institutional environment with consistently high risks and the occasional uncertainty. While this general characterization suggests that colonial trade indeed became more predictable over time, our findings do offer a nuanced view that emphasizes the continued coexistence and interplay of institutional risks and uncertainties and the strategies to manage them. Dutch business entities had the tools to trade successfully in uncertain environments in the early 17th century, though these were less used in later periods. And by the late 18th century, risky environments remained for which there were no adequate strategies available, as seen in the case of the 7 Years' War. An examination of two among many strategies, subject to it and financing risk, illustrates how Dutch business entities attempted to navigate the particularities of enterprise in the restrictive political-economic context of foreign empires, alongside the general challenges that accompanied long-distance trade as a whole. However, the complexity of the commercial, political, economic, and legal environments of trans-imperial trade, as well as its multipolar nature, still solicits a much more thorough examination. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup pour cette présentation ample et originale, et notamment ce jeu sur les réglementations et les statuts. Donc on va aborder la dernière communication, qui est un nouveau duo, celui de Carlos Alvarez Nogal et de Sergio Sardone, donc respectivement de l'université Carlos III de Madrid et de l'université de Naples Frédéric II, avec un retour à Séville et l'examen de la faillite de la banque Licarazas, en mai 1552. Vous avez la parole et vous avez choisi de parler debout. Vous n'êtes pas puni. Je vous en prie.
Thank you. I know I'm very aware that I'm the last of a long day of great papers, excellent presentations, and also great debates. So before you be distracted for your own thoughts, I would like to explain what this paper is about. This paper is about Domingo de Lizarraras. Is a private business and a public bank that is a very interesting institution because it's public, but at the same time is private. And the failure of this bank in Seville in the decade of the 50s, as was explained before in the presentation by Mark, the 50s, in the middle of the 16th century in Spain, was a very difficult decade in a very successful century, at least for Spain, of economic growth. And we need to think about that and to explain this very well. Why we study Domingo de Lizarraras? Because it gives us the opportunity to understand these difficulties at this time, in this decade. And also to understand, and that's the second main idea of this paper, the effects of the market intervention by the government, in this case by the king, by the monarchy, and how this intervention changed the business activity in one of the most important cities in Castile, in Europe at that time, because Seville was not just a city of Castile, it was a city of Europe, given that it was the port of the American trade. For that reason, Domingo de Lizarraras gave us the opportunity to study this market intervention. Today, we are in a very interesting historical period, because we are again in that about tariffs. Everybody is talking about tariffs, and market, at the end, is a market intervention. Well, we will see the effects of this market intervention in the 16th century. And let me say a second thing. I am going to present briefly this research today here, but the real expert of this period is Sergio. And he knows not only Domingo de Lizarraras very well, also all the merchants and the people that I was going to talk about here today, and also the archives and the documents and everything that is related. So I think this paper is here today thanks to the hard work done by Sergio. Okay, let me okay, go. Domingo de Lizarraras is a Basque merchant, and after several trips, he established himself in Seville with his family in the mid-20s to trade with the Americas. Was the main idea of the family. But at a certain point, he decided to become a banker. And for that reason, as probably you know, in order to have a public bank, you need to ask the local authorities, in this case, the municipality of Seville, for the license to become a public banker. He contributes together with his wife, and that's the reason. Of course, this is not a picture of Domingo, but is here to show that this public bank would be impossible without the help of two women, both the wives of Domingo, the first and the second one. The first offered part of the capital necessary to establish the bank, and the second one, in this case, Isabel, I'm going to, Isabel de Sandoval, had a wealthy family of notaries in Seville, and his father offered 10,000 ducats in order to get the license in 1549. In the late 1552, his license was renewed again, but after 3 months, the bank closed the doors and went bankruptcy. Thanks to the bankruptcy, we have today a lot of information, not the accounting books. This is a very important problem in Spain. Many times when we study bankers, we don't have the luck that in Italy you always find many accounting books everywhere. In Spain, it's just the contrary. For any reason, we don't have too many, or almost no one. But in this case, we have all the procedures, the judicial procedures, and then we have a lot of information about this case. Domingo de Lizarraras is well known in the previous literature, and we have important contributions by Ramón Carande, helped by Ote, and also later Santiago Tinoco studied also this case. And of course, Sergio published, and also Ortiz Arza, new data, new information about this Basque presence in Seville. To provide this, well, I explained this before, the research objectives of this paper is to provide and publish information about Lizarraras Bank, especially management, customers, and also the main guarantors, but also identify possible reasons for his failure in the context of a general crisis, which allow further analysis of the local credit networks and the performance of many banking institutions in Castile. The interests of large Castilian and Basque merchants converge with those of many foreign financiers, especially to make businesses in America. The methodological approach has two different ways. The first one is exogenous. That is the difficult credit situation in the 50s in Castile. A crisis caused by the Crown intervention, as I mentioned before, in the credit markets. The law prohibiting the use of letters of exchange, of bills of exchange in the Iberian Peninsula since the 51. For example, caused a widespread shortage of liquidity affecting all types of business, particularly trade. I have to say here that almost everybody knows the suspension of payments of the Spanish monarchy. The first one was, according to the literature, to the historiography, was 1556, just at the very beginning of the Philip II reign. I have to say that this was not a royal order, was not a decreto, was just a letter that Philip sent from Flanders when he was fighting against France to the Council of Finance in Madrid. When the letter arrives, and the letter says, the king ordered to the people in the council to exchange, not to stop the payments, just to exchange the consignaciones of the asientos, the orders, the libranzas to the bankers, for titles of public debt. The bankers receive, in exchange for the consignaciones, a public title, public debt title, the juros, and they had the opportunity to sell this title in the market immediately. But in the case of the consignaciones, they have to wait until the consignaciones was established the date to be paid. So for the bankers, the idea was perfect. What the Council of Finance did, ignore the letter. So we need to wait until Philip arrived from the Low Countries in 59 to have the first decreto actually in the 60, in this case ordering exactly the same in the 1560. Something that not many people know is the order by the Crown in 51 to stop the circulation of bills of exchange in Castile in 51. Nobody cared about that, but that's the real impact in the credit markets at that time. And this is one of the consequences of this decreto, this order, was the failure of this bank, Domingo de Lizarraras, and many other banks. The second aspect, methodological approach, is endogenous. Lizarraras had invested in illiquid assets, as I will explain later. So when you have a crisis of a credit crunch, because, of course, if the monarchy stopped the circulation of bills of exchange in the whole Castile, there is a problem with credit. There is no money for credit anymore. And then people with problems of illiquidity, like, for example, Lizarraras, goes to bankruptcy. Then we use sources judicial, of course, the officers of the Casa de la Contratación against Jerónimo Cattaneo, one of the partners, hidden partners in the bank, and also notarial acts and previous studies. Here you have the graph of the trend, is Chani, is the volume of trade with America is growing all the century, except for the period in the 50s. And this is strange because, as I explained before, the whole century is a very successful century of economic growth. You have increase in population, expansion of agricultural production in Castile, a great number of merchants coming from everywhere in Europe in order to trade in Spain, in Castile, with America also. So Everything is positive, except for the 50s. Why this happened? Because the Cortes, why the monarchy decided to stop bills of exchange in Castile? Well, it was so important to have credit for the whole economy, for this economy that was growing so fast. Because, of course, the cities complain about the interest rates, the prices of credit. Then, one solution to stop these high prices in credit is just to control prices. Once you control prices, you don't allow the market to work very well. Here, the Crown also requested, and this is another very, very important thing, the Crown also requested several forced loans in Seville starting in December 53, with the requisition of private remittance arriving in the fleets, and later are very important in the 56, 57, 58. The freezing of credit in the financial market, the seizures of precious metals, and several shipwrecks that occurred during those years had a serious impact on the Carrera de Indias between 51 and 60. The credit difficulties was not only noted in Seville, also in the other important market in Castile that was the Medina del Campo, first of Medina del Campo. The crisis also had an impact on the first. Its calendar suffered alterations because many debtors could not meet their obligations. Between 52 and 55, there were several bankruptcies in Medina del Campo. Villafranca, Arbieto, Alonso, Lomelín, Arteagas, Gaspar Enriquez, many merchants. And they affected also the stability of Delgadillo, Arbieto, Aragon, and Medina banks. So we have problems with the banks in Seville, with the banks in Medina, and I'm sure that with other banks in other cities in Castile that we need to study much better. The merchants demanded the immediate repeal of the royal order, of course, considering it the main reason for the lack of money at the first. But the monarchy decided to wait. It was not until the end of the decade when the King, Philip II, decided to abolish part of this law against the bill of exchange, the circulation of bill of exchange. Before this regulation, the merchants paid 9 and 10% for their credits. After the regulation, they were unable to get credit for less than 20%. It was not a very good business. Bankruptcy and the confiscation of assets. Let me give you some details about Lizarrasas. Lizarrasas' bankruptcy was declared in March 1153, shortly after renewing his license as a public banker for the third time. It's very difficult to know the reason, which is the reason why a bank go bankruptcy. Because actually we have the judicial documents and people are fighting each other, blaming each other. So if they were not many times able to know at that time, for us, that we don't have all the information and all the documents, it's very difficult to know exactly what was the real cause of this. But we know that the context, for example, in this case, it seems like everything started when Arbieto asked Botti 17,500 ducats for some bills of exchange. Botti claimed that the money was in the bank of Lizarrasas, but Domingo refused to pay. And then the authorities of the city declared the bankruptcy. 17,500 ducats. It's not too much money for this bank. The banker, had the possibility to go to the market and borrow this money and pay. But if you have a frozen market, no possibilities to get this money when you need this money. So for that reason, the bank went to the bankruptcy. The creditors appointed 5 deputies to represent them: Botti, Lomelin, Aresti, Ruiz, and Sanchez Dalbo. And of course, the sureties in turn also appointed their own commission: Robleda, Escobar, Areiza, and Ramirez. Lizarraras lost everything, all his patrimony in Basque Country, in Seville, everything. And actually, he died in jail. Here, the table, and I'm going to go fast, the table shows one of the activities of the bank in Seville. Not only Lizarraras, but many of these public banks help buyers of gold and silver to be intermediaries in the market. When the silver came to Seville from America, the silver and the gold needed to be minted in the mint, and then the timing in the process, the public bank helps these people to buy and sell and transfer and make the transfer. Here you have the transactions that Lizarraras was able to catch almost half of the treasure came in the last fleet before he went to bankruptcy. In this table, you have all the debtors of Lizarraras. 44% of the money lent by the banks was in the hands of only 18 debtors. Was a total of 500,000, more than 100,000 ducats. It's a huge amount. And if we exclude Domingo Lizarraras, the accumulated debt was 40% in the hands of these 17 debtors. And, well, I'm not going to enter in the details of this because you have we have actually all these names. And the last table is the investments of the bank. The way public banks were managed was often criticized because bankers were more involved in speculation than in the banking business, taking unnecessary risk. Some suspected that they invested their deposits in buying certain goods to later increase their prices in the markets. So here you have in this table the investments that Lizarraras were doing. At the same time, he was managing a public bank. According to the law of Castile, a bank could not invest in trade and could not invest in American trade because the timing was not very good. I mean, in banking business, you need to be ready to pay any amount when the depositor asks for the money. But when you invest in American trade, you need to wait at least or more or less 1 year until arrive the profits and then have the cash again. So it was not a smart decision to invest in this kind of things. And the law tried to control this, but the enforcement of the law was terrible and was impossible, actually. And in this case, you have several examples of how Lizarraras was the owner of several ships, goods sent to America, so he was actually involved in this trade that was forbidden for many of them. So, in conclusion, we have a case, Domingo Lizarraras. We know something, not everything, about him and his business. It's interesting because it's a public bank, but it's a private business. And at the same time, is a good example to study what happened in this important decade in Seville, but also in the whole Castile. Thank you so much.
Merci beaucoup pour cette ultime présentation qui nous rappelle qu'il y a des individus, hommes et femmes, derrière les faillites. Alors, j'imagine qu'il va y avoir beaucoup de questions. Vous connaissez la procédure, les petits papiers à remplir qui sont là à votre disposition. Mais avant ça, on va faire une petite pause d'une vingtaine de minutes et on revient pour répondre à vos questions. Merci. va poser toutes les questions pour une communication, l'une après l'autre, et les personnes, les communicants répondront à l'ensemble, à chacune des questions, mais en une seule fois. D'accord ? Donc on va commencer par la première relation, celle de Mark Steele, avec une question, mais je crois que je l'ai vue sortir, de Elena Garcia. Elle est sortie. Angel Aloza. Short question.
Okay. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for your papers. Very enjoyed. I want to make more than a question. I would like to make a comment on the Mark Steele paper about bankruptcy law and bankruptcy proceedings. And first to apologize because our group, we have a book now forthcoming, so it's not published yet, about bankruptcies and lack of liquidity and all these things, which is not appeared yet, but I hope shortly will give the light. It is true that there is not a bankruptcy law in the 16th century. It appears in the 17th century, but it doesn't mean there is not a practice on bankruptcy law, okay? Since at least, as far as I know, or as far as we know, of the 14th century, there is a practice on bankruptcy, and not all the bankruptcies are of bankers and people related to the banking, but also trade, businessmen, and many other activities. Actually, in Seville, there is a court or a name, a court of grades. The grades, grados, means why this name? Because what the judges have difficulty is to establish the order of the creditors to be paid. So this is they find difficulties to establish an order, the grade of the creditors to be paid, and this is one of the limitations to make or to produce the bankruptcy law. But it is in the 40s, in 1740s, I don't remember exactly the year, that appeared a book, the only thing is in Latin, a book by Salgado de Somoza. Well, this is the second one. The first one is the Diego Bolero y Cajal, Tractatus de Decotione Debitorum, in 1640, I don't know the year, based on the practice of the judges of the Court of Bankruptcy we have studied. So there are hundreds of procedures, and he wrote that book. And the second and more known book on bankruptcy is the Salgado de Somoza, Labyrinthus Creditorum Concurrentium, written or published in 1654, which has a special impact in not only in Castile, but all over Europe, and especially in Germany. In Germany, actually, people are jealous because they also develop a bankruptcy law, but they don't want to admit that that book was first published in Madrid. There are also some laws and some juridical material concerning bankruptcies in the Juan de la Ripia book in Curia Filippica, or which is the title is in Latin, but actually there is another title is Laberinto de Comercio Terrestre y Naval, Labyrinth of Commerce by sea and by land, and. Well, it's just this common, and it is. I am agree with the new economic historian when they when they talk about bankruptcies in Castile in 16th and 17th century, that they are not really bankruptcy. They are suspension of payments and some other, names or concepts. But what is going on in this time is that in the case of the big bankruptcies of the monarchy, the king is asking for money to pay the interest of the money he borrowed before. So it is not that he cannot get the money back of the first credit, but they had to ask for money to pay the interest. So we might not call this bankruptcy, but in practical terms, it is a bankruptcy. So this is the only comment I want to. Thank you very much.
That's not exactly a short question. Donc, Elena Garcia. A short question, not like this.
Tante grazie per le vostre relazioni, veramente molto interessanti. Sono contenta di avervi sentito. E la mia domanda, questa prima domanda è per Mark Steele. Vorrei chiedergli un approfondimento sull'argomento dei garanti, perché ha detto che questi garanti in questo fallimento erano un po' più dispersi o qualcosa del genere. Non ho capito bene cosa ha voluto dire con quella affermazione che ha fatto su questo, per dire così, pilare basilare della formazione delle compagnie bancarie. Grazie.
Grazie. Now, Dave de Ruische.
Very brief question, which is similar to the previous one. I'm very interested in the system of the fiadores, the guarantors. You stated that it did not function properly, and I was wondering why. Was there a lack of control of the creditworthiness of the guarantors, or was it more a snowball situation where all people, all market actors were affected by economic circumstances? Thank you.
Thank you. So, please. Mark?
Oh, do you want me to? Sorry, we're taking that answer. I beg your pardon.
No.
Thank you for the first. I'm relieved to hear you've got a book coming out about Spanish bankruptcy law because, well, presumably. As you probably noticed, I didn't say too much. I was intending to go into a little bit more detail. But the thing is, I agree. I think this is the problem. You can actually push bankruptcy tribunals, laws, etc., etc. I mean, you had merchants' tribunals, pie powder courts, where debts were settled within a day by a committee of merchants. And I know if you look at the Munimenta Guild Halli Londiniensis from about the 13th and 14th century, but there was an absolute rule in a pie powder court that no lawyer was to be allowed anywhere near the building. Because he would complicate matters and you wouldn't get a rapid solution. So you definitely can go back. I mean, in the written version of my paper, I referred briefly to the strategic bankruptcy of the Scala Florentine banking company in England in 1342. And I'm wondering, where we will exactly find the beginning of bankruptcy law. But before you had a formal process of bankruptcy, which is the way we tend to look at it. The American Bankers Association very clearly defines somebody who's a bankrupt is somebody who comes within the jurisdiction of the bankruptcy laws. In other words, they're called bankrupt because they come before a bankruptcy law. Before that, they're insolvent, they're bankrupt. The term's often used interchangeably, and I think this is a problem. We've had terminology raised a little bit earlier by Katja. So I'm also grateful for the references. A lot of the literature tends to assume that the big change in bankruptcy law came in England, but that is written by Anglophone historians, 1706. Julian Hoppett's book, of course, is a seminal book, and in many ways it's the starting point. I don't think we've had any papers on English history of bankruptcy in England here, but there we are. Guarantors. Well, the civilian banks had this complicated system, and it is, once again, it's in the written paper that in order to set up a bank, you needed these fiadores. Some of them were in for fairly small amounts of money, but I think the De Morga Bank, and these are figures I get from Tinoco Rubiales, who published a paper on this in 1991, at the same conference in Genoa that I did a paper on bankruptcy and insolvency. And I think there were about 125 guarantors for small amounts, 295,000 ducats altogether. Now, why? The thing is, not only was Pedro de Morga and Espinosa's implicated in the suspension of payments, but so were a lot of the guarantors, so that they couldn't come up with their guarantees. So it is, as the question was, a snowball effect. Andres de Leiria said that he had given fianzas 14,000 ducats, but he was actually in prison somewhere else, at Burgos or somewhere. He couldn't pay it because the Genoese ascentistas owed him money, which they weren't paying him because the king was not paying them. So, in other words, it's very much a ramified financial crisis which is going on. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Now for the second relation, Mr. Safley.
I wasn't going to ask a question, but I changed my mind. I really appreciate the splendid schematic of tools and strategies, and I found myself wondering as I listened, how do we put them in motion? When we talk about diversification, when we talk about all of the things that you listed on your slides, I thought, on the one hand, none of these things guarantee success, or resilience, according to you. Resilience does not guarantee success, and oftentimes the only way that we know that a firm is resilient is post hoc, that is to say, after it's survived and succeeded for a while. So I found myself wondering, and I'd be interested in having you reflect on this, because you have more experience of it than I do, is to say, if we were to turn to a student, a graduate student who was so misguided as to want to study bankruptcy as a means of getting at business practice and business structure in the pre-modern, how would we put this in motion? How would you tell him or her what is sufficient? What are the evidences, let's say, of a firm that is sufficiently diversified, sufficiently capitalized, so that in fact, these things would become applicable in the lived experience of business in the pre-modern, as opposed to the way we try to break down the indicators, with which I thoroughly agree, but they become static in a sense when we talk about them in this case. And what we want to do, it seems to me, all of us, is to put them in motion, in application, so that we can see them actually working to a certain extent in the pre-modern. So that's my question. Thank you.
Thank you. Elena Garcia. Oui.
No, come vi dico è che sono molto interessata in questa sessione e per il professore Denzel mi è piaciuto tanto quello che ha detto e vorrei sapere, siccome una delle fortezze di queste aziende è la conoscenza della contabilità come uno dei fattori che li fa diventare più resilienti. Quali, sono stati i libri di contabilità nell'area tedesca più diffusi, che io proprio questo non lo so, e qual era il tour o il giro, il percorso che facevano i giovani di queste città, i giovani di queste famiglie delle città, qual era il giro, andavano a quale altre città andavano per formarsi, per avere questa fortezza, no? Nello sviluppo dell'azienda. E un'altra domanda si riferisce al fatto che, secondo ho potuto capire, quando arrivano le crisi, queste aziende decidono di ridursi, no? Di ridurre un po' il suo campo di attuazione. Non so se l'ho capito bene, perché diciamo che in Spagna alla fine del Cinquecento, quando succede la grande crisi del 1596, alcune imprese bancarie fanno altrimenti, cioè si uniscono tendendo un po' a ridurre gli effetti della crisi facendo un'azienda un pochettino più grande. Mi piacerebbe un po' che mi dicesse qualcosa a questo riguardo. Grazie.
Grazie. Mr. Putfield.
Yeah, both my questions were already asked by my predecessor, so I'm going to really try to rephrase them a little bit. My first question deals with making the analysis more dynamic, so bringing time and evolution into the patterns that you have seen and the strategies that you have seen, because this is the right setting to give Fernand Braudel a renaissance. He talks about the trahison de la bourgeoisie. That seems to be a chronological evolution. We're not sure that that's really true, but these different generations, they make different choices. So what is resilience? What in the different generations? What does that mean? That's the first question. The second question builds further on you it's about the size of these companies. So there is a tendency of them in the 16th century to indeed reduce their size. They become smaller, or they try to become smaller. But how does that really work? Because they still need sizable capital, for example, to lend to princes, to be active in mining. So if you reduce the sizes, that means that they have to collaborate with other firms, and obviously that brings new kinds of problems for resilience. So I wonder what your thoughts are about that. Thank you.
Matthias Berlandi.
Yeah, many thanks. We solved also my question already during the coffee break, but nevertheless, I think it's it's quite worthwhile to think about it, perhaps also in a wider context, because I was wondering, when we are talking about resilience, we are often looking at specific actors. So what are they doing? What are the strategies to survive crisis situations? And I recently stumbled about quite interesting post-Keynesian thinkers like Minsky, and they propose a hypothesis called the inefficient market hypothesis that claims that when you have a market that is controlled by an oligarchy or by a very few people, the market becomes more volatile and less predictable, and thus it becomes harder to develop strategies for sustainability and resilience. So my question then is it also worthwhile to think about structural reasons why a certain resilience strategies failed in the 17th century but worked then in other generations? And is there a structural element to that? Many thanks.
Thank you. Marianne Kowalewski.
Thank you for a very stimulating paper, Marcus. I have 3 questions, but I'm going to only ask one in the interest of time.
Thank you.
Yes. And this is, I was very struck about, in your chart, about what you call the loyalty of trading servants. And then I started thinking, well, when would, and what measures would these businesses be able to take to ensure their loyalty? I mean, this is a given back in the Middle Ages. You need to use family in order to ensure trust. So when was it, and what meant that this began to change? That what were the measures and the strategies? And then I realized that De Boer and Megron actually kind of answer the question for you, in the section on agents, which you have in the paper and didn't really talk about. And they mention trade commissions, compensation tied to performance, consignment agreements making it more difficult for agents to misappropriate assets. So I'm wondering, do you see the same type of measures taken in these 17th and 18th century Dutch businesses in German businesses in the 17th century when presumably larger companies would be more likely to occur? Yeah, and this one particular thing about the loyalty of agents or servants.
Thank you. Thank you, Maria. Giuseppe Petarelli.
Grazie. Ringrazio anch'io tutti coloro che hanno parlato e che ho ascoltato questa sera. Mi scuso con Markus Denzel perché ho ascoltato la sua relazione che comunque mi ha molto interessato, soltanto in parte, sono arrivato quando era già iniziata. Intervengo sulla relazione di Markus Denzel perché sono un medievista e sono stato molto sollecitato dalla scelta che ha fatto di proporre all'attenzione di noi tutti un confronto tra questa evoluzione che ha tratteggiato per il lungo XVI secolo tedesco, che conduce a scelte che orientano verso aziende di più piccola dimensione, e ha confrontato questo con una sorta di punto di partenza cronologico iniziale, che sono le supercompagnie, quelle che descritte nel libro di Edwin Hunt, che tutti conosciamo, le famose compagnie fiorentine della prima metà del Trecento. E io ho apprezzato molto la sua relazione perché credo che proprio questo sforzo di riflettere e di tracciare una linea evolutiva tra la gestione del rischio e la gestione della resilienza sia importante, ed è una relazione che mi sembra che ha mostrato come è molto rilevante precisare bene, concettualizzare bene gli schemi che sono stati mostrati. Sono uno sforzo di concettualizzazione che ci consente di rivolgere domande più precise alla situazione che stiamo studiando. Però appunto mi sembra che proprio con questo riferimento che ci ha proposto all'esperienza precedente delle supercompagnie, in fondo ci viene indicato quello che mi sembra un problema fondamentale, il problema di una comparazione cronologica e spaziale, dal mio punto di vista, soprattutto tra la prima età moderna e l'età tardo-medievale, perché in fondo tra le supercompagnie della prima metà del Trecento e questa realtà di area germanica del XVI secolo in cui si apprende a gestire la resilienza, c'è in mezzo un secolo e più, un lungo XV secolo, in cui qualcosa avviene di rilevante, non c'è dubbio. Siamo a Prato, Francesco Di Marco d'Atini lavora sulla fiducia dei suoi corrispondenti, investendo su una rete che è una rete di fiduciari, oltre che su quella che è la struttura della sua azienda, ed è uno dei primi momenti in cui si sviluppa e si afferma, proprio nella seconda metà del Trecento e nel XV secolo, il commercio su commissione. Io penso appunto a quest'area che conosco meglio per letture che ho fatto, e che quindi è già qualche cosa di più rispetto a quello che già conosciamo dai tempi di De Rover, quando aveva chiarito, no, che il Banco Medici, altre banchi e altre aziende mercantili bancarie fiorentine del 400 non erano più quelle della prima età del 300, perché erano del holding companies a responsabilità limitata, eccetera. Già questa era una strada. Allora, non propongo naturalmente un'evoluzione lineare, perché sarebbe ingannevole, no? Della gestione del rischio e della gestione della resilienza. Però volevo chiedere se Markus Denzel concorda su questa necessità della comparazione che io avverto, e se ha degli elementi per proporre già spunti, aspetti di comparazione tra l'evoluzione che avviene in quest'area tedesca che ci ha presentato, le evoluzioni che avvengono precedentemente in area italiana, e anche rispetto all'evoluzione precedente che avviene nella stessa area tedesca. Ecco, mi fermo qui perché è stato abbastanza lungo. Grazie.
Grazie. Katia.
Marcus, thank you for this X-ray of a firm. It doesn't happen very often, and since we have PhDs in the room, this was actually really important, although I understand that once you do these, you get Tom and Jeroen saying, so where's the dynamism? Absolutely, but I think this is very helpful, mostly because I get particularly annoyed with the Anglo-Saxon literature that goes on and on and on firms in very abstract terms without actually understanding how firms and banks work. So I think this was really good. And from a heuristic point of view for the PhD students here, this was really, really helpful. There is one presumption in your paper that I don't think that you prove or demonstrate, and it is counterintuitive if you had presented this in a group of business historians, and that's the idea of the family. One of the problems of family firms and family banks is that families are very unreliable. It's very difficult to get the succession going and get the right guy to succeed you. This is, what the Japanese, the Saibatsus, the chaebols, everyone faces this, right? And societies discipline these men, because they're always men, into line to get what the firm needs, to extremes, right? What you're telling us actually is that in this case, it seems that the family was the answer to this succession, when actually you would expect that after one generation, the second generation, it all went to hell because of family, right? Holbein happened that, big bankers have problems. Even Thomas Hope, that is all of that and bag of chips, has problems in succession, and it's already the beginning of the 19th century. So explain to us a little bit, why do you have so much faith in the capacity and the competence of succession in the firm, instead of looking at the family, actually, and the problem of a succession as a risk rather than an answer to any problems that might have been out there? Thank you.
Thank you. Salvatore Ciriacono.
Yes, I have to praise the capability of Denzel to resume many aspects of our meeting, really. The German philosophers are always the best, no? But my question is, in any case, I think you stressed the fact of resilience. You gave very much more importance to resilience in different periods, as it was stressed. So the necessity to make this comparison. I think that you gave more importance to the fiscal aspect, economic aspects, and a little bit less to manufacture and the fishery. There was one table, and I have seen 2x, and perhaps I interpreted that you wanted to give a little bit more or less importance. The difficulties to overcome is a problem. Fishery and manufacture. And that has a sense, because these sectors have to afford the problem of resources. Is more difficult. The competition is also higher. So I think that's just on this problem, the society, the economy, has to afford the problem of resources. And on the other side, the fiscal problem is more financing, playing the capital, and so on. So, thank you.
Thank you. Daniel Scambrek.
Thank you very much for this very interesting paper. I would like to follow up on the point of the loyalty of the staff, of the servants. And it was already mentioned that the agents played an important role, but my question is on the role of the apprentices and the role of the apprenticeship as a preparation to work in the firm. And furthermore, what role did education of these servants actually play? Not only identity. Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you. Maintenant, il va prendre une grande respiration et il va...
Thank you very much for all these very interesting questions. And I would try to give a short summary. And I will begin with Salvatore's question, because, of course, you're right. And I didn't speak about the economic and social frame, yes? And this is very important, of course. But this was not the topic today. In the book I wrote about these things, you will see that the frame is the commercialization process of the 16th century in the wake of the European expansion and so on. And this is I have done all this in respect to this process in the long 16th century. The second, these are family firms. And Katja, you are very right that I had a focus on organizational resilience. And I said it sometimes. We can do the same paper under the focus of familiar resilience. But this is much more difficult because of the sources. The sources are difficult for the organizational resilience, but much more difficult for the familiar resilience. In our research group in Germany, we have one study, habilitation of one of my postdocs, Thomas Urban, who did exact what you would like to do. He puts the familiar resilience in his focus, but with sources from the late 19th and 20th century, which are much more dense in this time, and you need for this analysis of familiar resilience also some methods of the psychology. This is not my field, and so I say this is some topic for others to do, for my friend Thomas in Leipzig. And therefore, I have it in my mind that the family is very important. And we have in all the case studies familiar problems. And these problems were solved in very different ways, with money or yes, something. All you can think about, put away from the family, and so on. And this is very important for all these case studies, for the success as well as for the failure. Yes, especially we have the wonderful example of the Höchstädter, yeah, very great inner familiar problems, and also the Fugger. But they solved these problems very elegant with much money. This is I think this is a very important aspect. Let us come to the super companies from the late Middle Ages and their development. Giuseppe asked. I think this is very important. Of course, in their time, in the 14th and 15th century, these super companies were very resilient. But I didn't study them because of the sources, and in Germany, we have not so much and so good sources for the 15th century than for the 16th. especially what's about accounting and bookkeeping. The 16th century is much better, and in these sources you'll find many notes about the thinking of the so-called Regierer, the manager of these enterprises. Yes, the super companies in their time, very resilient, but in the commercialization process of the 16th century, with new challenges in logistic and transportation and marine insurance and all these things we heard today, they didn't get the instruments, or they can't work with the instruments in the same manner than the sole proprietorships we had, especially Nuremberg with Viatis and Pella and someone like that. I think this is a development we can observe, especially in Germany, because there were these challenges of the commercialization process in the 16th century very, very strong, and the reaction of most of these enterprises are very interesting. Some failed, and some changed their size. And this, I think we have, yes, becoming, it's one of the question of Jérôme, they became smaller because they changed their business. It's not only a question of capitalization, it's a question of changing business. We will take only one example, the Fuggers. It took their capital back from Spain over decades and invested it in manorial rights and land in Upper Germany. They became landlords and princes in Swabia and stayed rich. Yes, but their business was another. And the business was another between Jakob, the rich, and Anton, and their successors. Each generation, this is very simple, but each generation had her own business, and the business changed. And so they could get smaller in this development, but earn their money and stay rich. I think this is the way we can think about these developments. I take the other question of Jérôme with the dynamic with different generations. This is, you are very right, the different generations had different mechanisms, instruments of resilience management. The best example for this is the Welser Company. In each generation, you have quite different business, but different instruments, mechanisms of trying to be resilient, but they failed because the capital was put out after the in each generation to all the persons of the family, and at the end there was nothing available. Yes, but therefore we can say that these processes are perfect to observe. So, where can we observe such processes? And so I came to the question of Elena Garcia, the accountants and the ledgers. Especially the accounting and the bookkeeping is a wonderful source, because these are not only the numbers, but only notes and remarks, and so much information over the numbers that we can think of, or no, better, we can get an impression, let me say this, get an impression about the thinking of the regierer and the bookkeeper. And therefore it's, I think, very important that all these experts, and the regierer and the bookkeeper were experts, got a very, very good training in her youth. This was first the school in Germany, yes, writing and reading and so on, and then learning in their own enterprise, in the family, in different branches. They went from Augsburg to Seville or Lisbon or something like that, and then some years in Italy and or in the Netherlands. And so they got the innovative instruments in bookkeeping, in cashless payment, in marine insurance, all these things, and they brought this knowledge back to Augsburg, to Nuremberg, to Memmingen, Ravensburg, etc. And we know this because they had merchant manuals. They wrote down their experiences and where their whole knowledge that they got in this time. And so we can say that this is a very important for the managers as well as for the bookkeeper, but also, and this is a question of Tanya, for the servants. The servants made the same kind of education, of training, but not so long and not in the same, let me say, deepness, intensity, yes? And because they had also 1 or 2 or 3 years in another factory, and they came back and were trained in the headquarters, and then they had to go back to a factory. The loyalty, this is a problem of the trading servants, Marianne, of course, because, some of them took the chance to getting rich for their own. It's a problem of communication this time, yes? We know that the servants in Spain or in Portugal or in Italy tried to make business on their own, and there was no controlling. And they had to give a report and a balance every year, every 2 years, but there can be the situation that is false, not correct enough to say it in the best words, or they didn't report anything. We have all these things. And especially such illoyal servants were one of the reasons of insolvency and bankruptcy. We have this in the case of the Hirschvogel in Nuremberg, as well as in the case of the Mannlich, because the headquarters did not get information. What is there in Lisbon or in India? And this is the question of the loyalty. So, and last but not least, I will come to the question of Thomas Seffley, how to put these things in motion. Which are indicators? This is very difficult to answer because we can't, in the 16th century, we can't measure resilience. It's not possible. Our colleagues from economic geography tried to measure resilience in the 20th century. Yes, so there are very good research in Germany as well as in Italy, and they have models for bringing indicators together, but we can't do it, and so I can't answer this very important question, to be honest, because we have indicators, yes, the success at the end, but I can't say this enterprise was more resilient than the other. No, this would not be possible. I'm sorry for that, but this is the finding I can say. Thank you very much.
C'est nous qui remercions pour cette prouesse dans les réponses et cette synthèse. Donc on va passer à la troisième relation. Comment ça fait? C'est le...
First of all, I'd like to say I enjoyed your paper very much because it's so far outside my remit, what I usually study. And I was especially taken by a felicitous formulation, your regimes of exclusion, which resonated with me. Forgive me if you mentioned this and I didn't pick it up during your actual presentation, but it occurred to me immediately that exclusion fosters opportunism. It creates the black economy in essence, of all forms, piracy, smuggling, and this, far from mitigating risk, in fact, alters the risk and expands the range of risk. Along the same lines, you mentioned something that I haven't thought about in ages, that is to say bottomry, which is a form of marine insurance, basically is falling completely out of fashion, in part because it is itself so open to opportunism. I mean, basically, what you do is you take a cheap cargo and a boat, you sail the boat away, scuttle the boat, collect the insurance, which is worth more than the boat and the cargo at the same time, and you walk away a very rich man. And so to come to my question, or a very rich person, a very rich company, to come to the question, have you factored in these forms of opportunism which your regimes of exclusion actually foster, and the ways in which they alter and in fact expand the risk, not only for the metropole in your trans-imperial networks, but for the merchants that serve the metropole as well? Thank you.
Thank you. Ilario?
Grazie, felicitazioni per la sua presentazione. Due piccole questioni. L'assicurazione marittima, che io conosco troppo bene sulle 500, dal calcolo del prezzo del sicuro, non aveva solamente questione istituzionale, due questioni. Il commercio con l'America spagnola, se in commercio in Cambogia, se la flotta, sono dei navi con armata, tutto insieme, non è commercio libero, dalle 500, 600. E dopo un'altra questione, è nel prezzo del sicuro. Una questione, aveva molte questioni, ma il mercato di capitali. Chi voleva assicurare la nave? Per comparare geografica e temporale nel tempo. Il mercato di capitali a Madrid, a Siviglia, alle 600 è piccolo che il di Amsterdam o che il di Londra. Non si può comparare. In Madrid non aveva capitalisti chi voleva assicurare la nave, perché non aveva argento. È una questione che non è una questione istituzionale, è una questione del mercato di capitali. E come oggi, per comprendere il mercato di capitali di Londra o allora è il mercato di capitale di Singapore o di Hong Kong, non è il mercato di Milano o Madrid, per esempio. Grazie.
Grazie. Katia?
So 2 questions. One will just be a small little rope so that you can answer perhaps 2 questions on the insurances that Hilario just posed, but I will not start there. The first question is about, so you anchored your presentation on subject-to and maritime risk management regarding Dutch participation in overseas exclusive political economies. All good. Makes sense. I'm convinced. I've been convinced for a while. Why is this different from subject-to and maritime risk management for political economies that are exclusive but they're not overseas? What is the added value for your analysis about overseas, so engagement in overseas exclusive economies? When you look at subject-to and maritime risk, you could make exactly the same argument if you look at Dutch participation in Spanish trade, European trade in terms of embargo or war. The same goes for Dutch trade during Baltic wars or wars in the Mediterranean. I mean, it doesn't matter, right? Because all of these economies, all these political economies are exclusive regardless of where they are, except the domestic market in the Netherlands, meaning the Dutch Republic. So why the added value of these axes of analysis? The second question is going back to the insurances, but in a rather different way. So, Amsterdam insures everyone. The Portuguese, the Spanish, the French, everyone and their mother. Okay. Amsterdam also insures the Dutch. Makes sense to me. It makes sense that it insures foreign trade because capital markets are reduced, capitals are elsewhere, people don't want to take this risk because it's cheaper, whatever. You can argue this in many ways. So it makes sense to me that they insure the ships. What I am not convinced, particularly when you start with examples about Dutch ships being insured for the slave trade, is that, of course, the voyages that are being insured is not for the participation in the Spanish Empire, because that part of the trajectory that is to deliver to the Spanish Empire is actually the Curaçao, whatever, Portobello, Cartagena. It's not the slave trading voyage up to the Caribbean, by which, of course, not being want to be mean, so why are these voyages so expensive? And what would happen if you would compare them actually to similar insurances to the same slave trade voyages that are not going to serve the Asiento, because that's what you're talking about, the Asiento de Negros. I think the insurance are going to be as high, honestly. So the question remains, does it matter that you're trading in an exclusive Spanish colonial economy? Probably not. That's not where the costs are. The second sub-question on these insurances problem is that, so explain to me, if you are an insurer and you have a panoply of people coming to your door and saying, I want my ship insured. Okay, all good. So who are coming to your door? The French, the Spanish, the Dutch are. What for? For the same routes. Similar ships. So how do you manage to insure a Basque ship going illegally to the Americas or legally, or a French ship going legally or illegally from Bordeaux to Guadeloupe, and at the same time insure a Dutch ship that does exactly the same routes with the added possibility, not for the Spanish case, but for the French case, that they're doing this illegally? Because then the question is, are the premium? Is the price of the insurances higher for the Dutch than they are for the French and for the Spanish? Economic rationale would say no, the Dutch must be paying the premium on the insurances for the legal parallel, interloping trade in vis-a-vis the Spanish or the French that are doing it legally. However, what we know from the insurance market in Amsterdam is that that is not true. So what are we missing? And how can your analysis actually give us some food for thought on how to question this economic logic of competition for the insurance market? Because that is the that is the locking that Ilario is referring to, right? This endemic lack of capital elsewhere to keep up and bite it off the risks of lending money or insuring ships and cargo and men across different spectra of political economies, regardless of the flags that are flying on the ships. And if you can't respond to all, it's okay.
Thank you very much to both of you. I really enjoyed your paper. My question is on the aspect of subjecthood that you mentioned. And I wanted to ask, maybe you could elaborate a bit on the concrete legal implications of this regulation. My question would be, was it really necessary to restaff these ships every time? And what were the sanctions if this did not happen? Or in other words, how persistent or realistic was this claim for subjecthood? Because if I think about, okay, it's very anachronistic. Sorry, forgive me, but today it's really it's the opposite, like staff on ships, on trading ships, they are not at all, belonging to a certain nationality. They don't have a certain subjecthood. So, how realistic was this system? Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for those very challenging yet interesting questions. I'm thinking how to group them because we have very little time and we were asked to answer in very short sentences. Shortly, I think the first question of Thomas, that is actually what we find most interesting, I think, us both, is that indeed these regimes of exclusion actually allow for opportunities that can be exploited. So, for example, if you are a foreigner in Seville or Cadiz, you have different rights, like you're excluded from participating, but you also have certain privileges and rights that you can use in your advantage. And we see that this is something that the Dutch do that are in the Netherlands trading in the Spanish Empire, but also the Dutch who is trading in the French Empire, and also what I saw, the Dutch who are in Spain itself trading on these routes, is that they try to look for loopholes in the systems and change them in their advantage. And indeed that does alter and expand risks because then new risks come in. For example, what I found sometimes is when there then is a conflict, that becomes more problematic because then you have also issues of the fact that you're a foreigner, that you are, then the question of reputation becomes very important. So very shortly, I think this is sort of basically the key or the underlying question in our research that we have looked at, how these regimes of exclusion for the Dutch, because theoretically they are excluded, how that allows for some to still enter that system and exploit it in a way that is very profitable in a lot of times. And we both see that happen very shortly. Katja had a lot of questions about insurance. So I will focus shortly on what I know about the Spanish Empire. If Tessa knows something more about the French case, then she can add to that. You are right in saying that these ships in the bottom loans that I looked at are, well, it says in these loans that they are for the voyages to, for example, like we saw on the slide, the Canary Islands, West Africa, Margarita and Caracas. However, and this is the great thing about notarial deeds, is when things go wrong, you actually get to see the real side of this thing. And often, what I found is that the real route doesn't match. So there is already something, then I think that's also something you saw, that what we have in the sources in the contract does not always mean that that's actually the route they are going to do, which then raises a lot of other questions. The question is the insurance. Yes. I think so, because when you're asking, because I think that is also, there was a question as well, like who are the guys actually doing this? When you look at the people that are giving these loans, they are also the same people that also do these voyages. So they are on the one hand the merchants organizing voyages, and on the other hand also investing in other people's voyages. So, for example, the one on the slide was very clearly a family member of the person that organized this. So they see it really as an investment opportunity, I think, because, I mean, there are, if it goes wrong, then you miss the collateral often, because if the ship goes, then you have a problem. But if you invest in multiple bottoming loans, the chances are high that one of them at least succeeds, and then the profits are extremely high, because sometimes you have insurance rates of 100%. What you were saying about that these were for the Asiento de Negros, that's actually not the case, because the bottoming loans I looked at, most of them were not. The question then is, if they had a legal way to do these voyages, in other words, did they have a license that allowed them to go to Spanish America? That is not totally clear, but reading between the lines, I think most of the times they didn't, which means that you have a lot of uncertainties that you have to account for, and a lot of risks that if you enter a port, that you are refused or confiscated. And then we also see in the sources that they try to find, again, legal loopholes, trying to get some sort of compensation, or trying to fix part of that cargo. Or I sometimes wonder if they already accounted for this. So they knew perhaps that going to Port A, they could perhaps sell an X number of enslaved people. That was profitable in a sense. They could get silver for that. Perhaps in the next port they didn't, but they could at least claim part of that. So they accounted for a lot of risks, and I think that explains why these insurances, or sorry, these premiums are so high. But that's what I wanted to clarify. What else? Do you have some? Yes.
Yeah, I do want to add that we have, especially in notarial deeds, about these insurances, there's often a very extensive list of all of the underwriters that are involved. So we do know exactly who these people are. I just haven't gotten around to tracing them, basically. And of course, who they are also will tell us a lot about their motives, because we are quite familiar with everybody who is in Amsterdam around this time, but we haven't arrived at this stage yet. But the documentation is there, and we will be able to answer these questions. We also know that there were, in fact, a lot of conflicts with the insurers about also, well, fraud or being cheated. We have general average documentation, which blatantly states, indeed, some of the false destinations, meaning that they were also lying to the insurers. So just to add that for the French case. I would like to respond briefly to the question about the subjecthood. Different countries had different legal standards pertaining to the specifics on the subjecthoods of the crews. For example, in English law, there is one source which states that 2/3 of the crew have to be English subjects, whatever that means, for the ship to be considered English in the English system. And for the French, I believe they state the officers have to be French, so it tends to differ. How realistic that is, I am still not quite sure about that, because I, for example, have a document about a Dutch ship where apparently the crew pretended to be English, and I'm not sure how you would convincingly go about that if you are in the 18th century and why they would believe that, but apparently it was attempted, so they reasonably believed that this could work. The realism of a subjecthood claim in general also really depended on the background of the claimant. So as we stated in the presentation, if you have a past residence in a certain place or ancestry, that really helped. But we do know that sometimes it could get very complicated. For example, if there were merchants who were claiming to be French to claim some assets in France, for example, it could get very complicated in court, very diplomatic procedures, which could take ages, with ambassadors writing, I don't understand this either, which is always very reassuring to me when I don't understand this as well, that the historical actors themselves also are very confused about this. So just to show how ambiguous this could be, which is quite paradoxical when you consider that entire economic systems were based on this principle, right? So you would expect them to have very clear ideas about this, but they did not. So this causes a lot of trouble.
Merci beaucoup. Donc on va passer à la dernière série de questions. Oui. Vous êtes dans le petit papier. Did you make a paper? No. No. Yes. Yes. Elena Garcia. Elena Garcia. Please.
Conosco bene il lavoro che hanno fatto Carlos e Sergio e mi piacerebbe dare testimone di quanto è difficile studiare proprio un caso di fallimento dalla prima all'ultima pagina, no, di questo tipo di documentazione. E un po' collegando con la presentazione del professore Steele, vorrei sapere la vostra opinione del fatto che a Siviglia ci fosse un monopolio di queste compagnie bancarie. Qual è stata, diciamo, l'influenza di questo fatto che ci sia un monopolio all'ora di concedere licenze nello sviluppo, nell'andamento generale del contesto bancario sevigliano? Grazie.
Merci. Monsieur Poucheville, je vous appelle. Pardon, c'est très formel.
One sentence question. Why was the bank not too big to fail? Why was there no bailout of this bank? That's 2 sentences, but I kept it short.
Thank you. Katia?
Well, thank you for your presentation in your paper. Obviously, both of you are powerhouses on matters of finance. So there's a room full of Spanish colleagues and Italian colleagues that work on something that I personally try to remain far away from, la monarchia, la monarchia, la monarchia, la monarchia. there's one fundamental thing that I don't understand about the monarchy, our shared monarchy, right? So the monarchy has rights, and monarchy has resources. So you would presume that the monarchy has state capacity. And all of a sudden, what we know that the monarchy cannot do, it seems to me, reading the works of most of you in this room, is that the monarchy has two problems. Transforming the resources into monetary species in a controlled way by which deflation and inflation does not crack the system left and right. The second problem, circulating means of payment. Because of war, because of taxes, because you get resources not where you need them, but you need resources elsewhere. So I think these are the two problems of the monarchy when I read your works, right? So my question is then the following. The monarchy has the need of private entrepreneurs, officials, people from the church, bankers, merchants, everyone and their mother, to do these two things, the transaction, so moving A to B with exchange, and to actually capture the rights and the resources on the ground. The acientos, contratos, whatever, all the estancos, everything. And then the monarchy wakes up one morning with good reason and says, actually, we're not paying interest anymore. We're bringing all the system to a freeze, because that's what you argue. And actually happens. And one of the things they do, and this is very interesting, because this is the first time actually I've heard this, that the first thing that they stop is the bills of exchange, by which then the problem is not so much on the resources, but actually on the transactions and on the exchange, right? While a lot of the literature gives the impression that the problem is on the resources and not on the exchanges. So this is really, I think for me, very new. But then I have a very technical question. Why do the people that are holding the bills of exchange, that are all these private people everywhere, do not replace the bills of exchange with promissory notes? Because this would be what the Dutch would do 100 years later. You just transform all the bills of exchange in promissory notes, and we can move on. And the king can wake up 2 years later and say, now I'm going to pay. And we're all on pause, but on liquid pause. Isn't this possible under the monarchy? Is it the problem that the people that are holding the bills of exchange and burning with them do not have the social quality to sort it out? Is this a question of backwardness? I never identified the monarchy or the people working for the monarchy as backward, by the way, but I mean, what is it that all these very intelligent, very engaged people cannot find an alternative mechanism to sort this out? Not quickly, but perhaps surely, right? And the shocks are there so cyclically that at some point you would think that by 1596 we have learned how to solve these. Just a question. And is the monarchy the problem, or is the merchants, the bankers, the system itself the problem? I know they interchange. But the problem is we're always looking at the monarchy. The monarchy always buys default because the monarchy starts the default. Not sure. Just putting it out there.
Thank you. Dave de Richet.
Yes, I liked the case study of the bank very much. It triggered some questions with me. I saw that right before the bankruptcy there was still an attraction of this bank. Yeah? So you had a sudden attractiveness. I'm not sure whether it was loans or deposits. I guess it was deposits that were invested in the bank. I was wondering to what extent you would encounter a phenomenon that is described in law and economics literature as the gamble for resurrection. So where you have firms or debtors that are on the verge of collapse and then all of a sudden try to present themselves as being very attractive, issuing loans at very low rates, accepting deposits at very high interests, and then sort of all of a sudden have a very short squeeze in the number of creditors that are involved. So I was wondering whether you find some examples of that in the period that you're studying.
Thank you. And Jelena Arleftis.
Last year and I forgot the system. Well, I came to sympathize very much with Domingo Lizarrara, and excuse me because I am ignorant of the systems of 16th century. I'm of 18th, 19th century. But I have all the questions that Katja put, and but I would, if it is possible, I want a little bit of a context here. How many bankers of this sort were? There were state bankers, but yes, was there any kind of connection with merchants? And I mean, the guy did the reasonable thing. He was, because all traders, all international traders in the 18th and 19th century were doing three things: shipping, trade, shipping, and finance. Okay, they were all three things. So was he just doing banking? And yes, why he couldn't get out of it by also going to trade? He tried to invest on ships, but certainly he did also trade. So yeah, that's the really the main question. But it was a fascinating case. Thank you. And who lends ship owners? I mean, is connected with, I mean, there is, the merchants were doing these three things. So some of them were probably specialized in one of the of these three. But this triplet really depended on each other and also helped, supported each other.
Thank you. No. So you have to. It's your turn.
We can share the answer.
I don't know if this microphone. Does it function?
Rispondo io a Elena. La prima risposta in italiano. Procedimento. La concessione di una licenza bancaria era legata a una richiesta che andava presentata all'Ayuntamiento di Seviglia, cioè al Consiglio municipale. L'autorità municipale è quella che rilascia il permesso per esercitare questa attività in un numero limitato di anni. La condizione per esercitarla era presentare una lista di garanti, di fideiussori, e secondo poi anche gli accordi che i soci di questa compagnia bancaria avevano, potevano poi modificare anche la struttura societaria. Perciò in un primo momento la società aveva una durata specificata, ma la durata non necessariamente coincideva con quella che era stata fissata, perché dopo 2 anni, per esempio, poteva subentrare un nuovo socio e lì si attivava un nuovo procedimento per fornire le garanzie prestate, stabilire il capitale complessivo a garanzia e quello invece proprio dei soci partecipanti. Penso sia sufficiente, vero? Grazie.
The question, Jerome, your question was why this bank was not too big to fail. That's the, well, there is not only one bank in Seville at that time. So you have in Castile, according to the law, we have competition, bank competition, and actually it's something, this idea was by the Crown and by the people in the city. The city claimed that the competition was good for the city and for the business trade. So it means that when you don't have concentration, of course, more people in the business, small businesses, more danger that one of them is in the situation, like in this case, Domingo Lizarrara's, illiquid in some moment, in the bad moment, in the worst moment at that time, the failure, the bankruptcy. And that happened. Everybody knows that this is the environment, and for that reason, the strategy of everybody was not just trust on the justice, on the law, the formal institutions, economic institutions, but a strategy of diversification. Instead of put all your money, or your bills, or your networks through only one banker, having several, spread the risk and reduce at some point, and then they have the opportunity to save at last something. That's the only answer that I have for you, sorry. Katia, answer? Do you want to? Okay. Katia, always difficult questions. But very good, thank you. Because difficult questions is something that I like because obligate you to think about it and to challenge your hypothesis and yeah. So in this, I mean, I agree with you. Everybody is thinking about the monarchy because two questions. The first one, everybody is thinking about the monarchy considering the difficulties for the resources. But it's not because, I mean, in the 16th century, as I explained before, Castile, the Spanish monarchy had many bad things, but the good things, at least for the monarchy, was a great capacity to collect taxes. Actually, at that time in the 16th century, according to the people that study the fiscal systems, Castile was able to gather 7 times that the money collected by the English crown. So 7 times is a lot. So this fiscal capacity of the state means a growing economy, as I explained before, and you see only one graph, but there are many other data about that. It means that the monarchy has no problems with resources. The problem is how to manage the money in Castile, in Spain, because this is not a nation. This is the idea of the 19th century, the 20th century today, is the Spanish monarchy. It means territories all over Europe, even in America, in Philippines. So how to deal with these transfers with a lot of resources that are coming, going. So that's the problem. And then you need experts, and the experts were bankers. For that things, the Spanish monarchy had no problems to have foreign bankers, like the Genoese, that were not subjects of the king, but were very useful for the Spanish monarchy in order to solve this problem. The second question, that is a little bit more difficult to answer in a short time, is related with what happened in this context of crisis. Well, I have to say that the people in the cities were complaining because interest rates were higher than what they expect. And for that reason, what they do was complaining to the crown, asking for regulation. Stop. We want, instead to pay 9–10% interest, we want to pay nothing, or just 1% or 2%. So do it. You have the power to establish a law to do this. And the monarchy collect taxes in the cities. And for that reason, the monarchy was the ally of the cities, the people, the elites, because they had the money and the capacity to collect taxes for the monarchy. And for that reason, you have the political institutional, the Cortes, and in the Cortes was approved the most important tax for the monarchy at the time, that was the alcabalas, the only tax that accept titles of public good. For all these reasons, once the cities complain about something, the monarchy listen and try to facilitate what they ask. Even though it's bad for the economy, it's bad for the cities, it's bad for the monarchy too. But they make mistakes. Actually, what happened later in the 60s, in the 70s, in the 80s, the story is going to be in this way. So, short thing here is in this process of stop bill of exchange, the first measure was to stop in Castile. And then what happened? Traders went to the hands of the foreign traders. Of course, instead of asking 9%, they asked 25%. Everybody complained, and the business was reduced. It was not a complete stop of everything, but of course, when you have higher prices, less people has the capacity to buy or to pay that prices, and the business was reduced. Well, more or less, I try to do the answer.
If I can add something, for conjuncture, it's very complex because there were several problems: the war, the flow with the Carrera de Indias were cut by the necessity for the marriage of Philip, for example. The king required something 18 ships, and then in the particular cases, which was the most relevant aspect, endogenous or exogenous, that Carlos is explaining in the presentation. It's very complex to say, but maybe in a different conjuncture, the merchant and the banker, because this is another problem, the involvement of the banker in the American trade, because Domingo de Lizarrazas began as a merchant. He has 20 years of experience in that activity. Then he didn't lose that pulsion, no? Maintain this characterization. He was an owner of 3 or 4 ships that we discovered, maybe more than. Then, in the particular conjuncture, the impression that with Pragmatica, with the action of the crown, why the banker fall? Carlos has explained that he was involved in the mint system. Then, when the crown required the treasure, the banker didn't have, because it was empeñed in activity, in payment, and reimbursement, and several things. Then it's very complex to generalize this argument, these topics. In this case, both aspects are relevant for me.
Okay. The question about the deposit bankers, yes, this bank it's a merchant, and this is related with another question later. You say merchants did 3 things. Well, it's exactly in the 16th century in Seville, in Castile, in general. Actually, when after Mark explained the 70s, when the two public banks in Seville disappeared in 76. There were not public banks in Seville for several years. The king needed and asked the city to have a new one, or many. And the city say, we don't need to invest and to do this because we have merchants, and they do everything. So in order to borrow money, we have merchants that are working in the financial sector. In order to get credit for our trade, they have the capacity to do, they have the connections, the networks. So what is the difference? That the city needed, according to the king, a public bank because the king wanted to have secure institutions to collect taxes in the city and to facilitate all this idea of moving resources of the crown. And the monarchy didn't want, at least Philip II didn't want to trust on private businesses only, and the king wanted to have a public institutions, not just a Monty, a taula in Aragon, but some kind of public institutions to be secure that everything was okay. And of course the city didn't agree, and there is another story. So, but it means that you have, the case is, we have merchants doing exactly the same business that bankers, and sometimes it's difficult to see the difference, the line between one and the others. And trying to answer the other question, yes, they are deposit banks, because at the end, the people, the merchants, use these public banks in order to create reputation, in order to save money, or just to make transactions with other people in the city and outside of the city. This bank was connected with the Medina First banks, and then the amount, the interest paid usually in the 16th century was around 8%, 7%, more or less the same in the 17th century. So the competition was against what a banker like this offered, the prices, the profits that you can get if you play the game of the first, that can be 14, 15% per year, or buying a title of public good that at that time in the 16th century was between 10% and 7%, 5% in some cases. So more secure public titles of public debt, risky investments, the first, something in the middle, the deposits in this kind of banks, 7%. More or less that's the game. And I think I answered.
And for Jelena, your question on the number of bankers, no? Well, depends of the years. In this period, in a previous article that I published on the Basque activity on Seville, I indicated the number of the bankers. In this case, there were 5, 6 according to the company of Leardo, because there were 2 Leardo, Franco Leardo, the ancient banker, and Pedro Juan Leardo. Pedro Juan Leardo, the bank of Pedro Juan Leardo, or Juan Pedro Leardo, falls in 52 previously. After there is a crisis of other bank, but the number could be between 5 or 6. After the phase of the Leardo and Lizarraza and Ottaviano Negron, other bank, the number of the bankers remain 3 or 4 because Morga, the Morga banker, began his activity in 1551 here. Then we can have between 5 or 4, but after the crisis this crisis remain in 3 or 4 banker. Okay? Till the crisis of 1575.
Oh, non, c'est bon. Merci beaucoup alors à tous. Prego, les membri della giunta possono stare, abbiamo una riunione.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you very much. We will see us for dinner.
No, because I have